Hi, everybody. Rick here. I usually start these episodes with a call to action for the Patreon and by thanking our patrons. And while I do appreciate them very, very much, I wanted to try a different call to action today. If you're a listener to the show, if you like what we do and you haven't done so yet, please consider giving us a rating and/or a review on Apple Podcasts or Podcast Addict. Leaving a rating and a review can help push the show into the feeds of others who listen to similar shows. It helps the show grow, and it helps us evolve. It would mean the world to me, so if you haven't done so yet, please give us a rating and a review over at Apple Podcast or Podcast Addict. You can also leave a rating on Spotify, although there's nothing for me to read there because they don't do reviews, so I can't read those, but it's appreciated all the same. Anyway, if you have a spare moment and wouldn't mind, it'd mean a lot to me. Thanks, everybody. Now, let's talk about some Catherine. What should young people do with their lives today? Many things, obviously, but the most daring thing is to create stable communities in which the terrible disease of loneliness can be cured. To misappropriate the musings of a certain someone. That someone being, of course, famed author Kurt Vonnegut. The terrible disease of loneliness. Have you ever been lonely? Craved the satiation of human interactivity? Perhaps platonic? Perhaps romantic? Were you able to express your feelings and find a healthy outlet? Or did you instead turn inward and try to bottle it all up? Companionship, loneliness, human connection. The aforementioned Vonnegut quote speaks to a profoundly human idea, as does the subject for today's episode, Atlus's 2011 cult hit, Catherine. I wasn't ingratiated into the video game scene in 2011, so this one managed to slip by me at the time. But at some point in 2014, 2015 or so, I happened to find Catherine completely by accident on the late PS Now streaming service. RIP to a real one. My attention was pretty quickly piqued by the cover art, intentionally risque, yet having an air of mystery about it with its anthropomorphized sheep and a single man with ram's horns. How serendipitous this proved to be, as within only a few short weeks, Catherine had risen to be one of my favorite games at the time. As it turns out, under Catherine's titillating surface lies core thematic material and illusions that say far more than one might guess when judging this game by its provocative cover. Today, I want to examine the thematic elements present in Catherine. Specifically, I will be focusing on two themes that, together, bind the story from start to finish and give this game a platform on which it can deliver a thrilling story that very well may leave you reflecting on societal concerns. Let's not be too hasty, though. Take a seat here at the bar and allow me to spin this yarn on one of my favorite Atlus titles. As a quick aside, I'll be primarily dealing with the original version of Catherine Classic, as it's called. Atlus re-released this game as Catherine Full Body with a large chunk of added content. While I find some of the mechanical upgrades meaningful, I largely find that the added story content does not serve the game's core thematic identity. Perhaps we'll cover it in another episode, somewhere down the line. Catherine sees you taking the role of 30-something-year-old Vincent Brooks, a software programmer who prides himself in living in the here and the now. He's not interested in lofty ambitions, in change. He likes life just how it is, thank you very much, low-key and familiar. This is an annoyance to his longtime fiancée, Catherine McBride, that's Catherine with a K, more on that in a minute, who is getting more and more persistent about taking their relationship to the next level. Marriage and kids. In the midst of anxiety over this, Vincent finds himself with a very attractive stranger in his hometown bar, and later, in his own bed. Amidst his newfound infidelity, Vincent begins having nightmares. Nightmares that resemble a rumored curse, the curse of the woman's wrath, going around, that has been laying claim to the lives of cheating men. And, as it turns out, Vincent falls into this category, beginning an affair with the coquettish blonde stranger he meets at the bar, who also happens to be named Catherine. That's Catherine with a C. This forms the basis of this story premise for Catherine, and it's hardly breaking new ground, at least with this notion of a love triangle. The narrative hook that soon grabs us is that of this mystery woman. We can never seem to remember the time we spent with her, only the mornings after, playing real-time detective looking for hedonistic clues, are we even aware of her. Nobody else seems to ever see her either, only adding to the mystery. This is entertaining enough on the surface, but it also serves as a fantastic vehicle for one of the game's biggest themes. Before we get there, though, I want to take a look at several other aspects of Catherine, and I want to start where so many good stories do. Over a nice drink. The Stray Sheep is our home base, our stomping grounds. It's the bar that Vincent frequents nightly with his core friend group, Johnny, Orlando, Toby, and the bar's waitress, Erica. Catherine is divided into two distinct modules of play. The nightmare stages, where we engage in puzzles of tower climbing and block pushing, and the Stray Sheep, a quasi-social sim hub. Atlus didn't keep the focus on this mode of play like it's done with the Persona series, but this is perhaps misleading. Indeed, the Stray Sheep is home to significant world building and furthers the thematic materials Catherine wishes to address. Let's talk about the bar patrons. Many patrons will filter in and out of the bar, and you can talk to as few or as many as you'd like, keeping in mind that time will progress forward with each conversation, and some patrons may come and go in the interim. To be curt, I am, of course, Rick, but to be curt for a moment, the vast majority of people that you meet in Catherine are, on the surface, awful. You learn all about their life stories, their acts of degeneracy, their antiquated and vile views on women, on status, on what it means to be, quote, a man. But herein lies one of Catherine's strengths. Question: who is most deserving of casting judgment upon others? Answer: well, it isn't you. Catherine presents all of its characters, all of its events, in a way that is devoid of superfluous judgment, and it's important that it's done this way. You're free to judge your fellow barflies as much or as little as you'd like. The same can be said of how often you interact with them. Throughout the story, Catherine will even make use of a sort of morality meter, presenting you with questions ranging from, what do you look for in a partner, to, are you a pervert? Letting you choose one of two answers representing chaotic and order. While this system ultimately fails as a meaningful game mechanic, it does have some form of success in this notion of judgment. Catherine is not seeking to judge you or judge the bar patrons, and doing so preemptively is exactly what the game wants you to do. You see, each of these bar patrons and their stories have some things in common. To begin with, each of these bar patrons to whom we can speak, with the exception of 3 women, are all having the same nightmares as Vincent. They're also all men. Throughout the story, the game gently nudges you towards speaking to the other bar patrons. Listen to their troubles, lend a receptive ear, and things might just look up for them. While on the surface these individuals seem unpleasant at best and heinous at worst, there's more going on than what's readily apparent. Dig deeper into Todd's story. His entire worldview on women and status is rooted in his father's intense verbal and physical abuse of him as a child. Todd's views of success are manifested in his father. A womanizing pig who would sacrifice others to climb the corporate chain and never quite gave Todd the validation or praise a child deserves from a parent. Speak enough with the policeman, Mr. Morgan, and you learn that he didn't kill his wife. He simply blames himself, for she was murdered after the two of them had an argument by an unknown assailant, an assailant that Morgan himself hasn't caught and arrested yet. Entertain the ex-journalist Justin long enough, and you learn that his doomer-esque predictions of men becoming extinct stem not just from this curse of the woman's wrath that's been going around, but also from his own self-hatred. A self-hatred that began due to his coverage of a young ballerina who took her life after her career exploded due to Justin's article about her and her success. Though its presentation excels at being provocative and fun, the real discussions lie just below. In a 2018 episode of Hidden Brain titled, "Guys, We Have a Problem, How American Masculinity Creates Lonely Men," podcast host Shankar Vedantam does a fantastic deep dive with guest experts on the topic of toxic masculinity. This isn't a new term by any means. What we've come to define as toxic masculinity has been around in one form or another since time immemorial. These traits and behaviors don't end at how one views the world or treats others. They extend to how we behave toward and view ourselves. One aspect that I feel most men not only experience but will freely admit to is the feeling of having nobody in whom to confide. And it isn't limited to just America, despite the Hidden Brain episode's title. Self-reporting isn't the most accurate measure of data, but time and again, one can find interviews or read accounts online of men feeling like they have nobody to turn to, nobody to whom they can express themselves. They explain that it's a feeling of having their, quote, manhood compromised, of being expected to man up or take it like a man, rather than freely and willingly expressing these emotions. I think every man has experienced this. I know I have. And so too have the writers at Atlus, as this is one of the two major themes, in my opinion, that they're driving at with Catherine. The presentation of each of these bar patrons, of each of these men, is one without extraneous judgment. The game itself doesn't provide a moral inventory on any of these characters. It presents them as they are, no more and no less. And through interacting with them, through listening to them, to their problems, one man to another, one human to another, we realize that these are a very hurt and broken group of people. Their maliciousness, their propensity to put others down so as to keep themselves on top, it isn't an inherited trait. It's not in their DNA. This is nature versus nurture. This is societal conditioning. They've developed these heinous masks as a byproduct of having no healthy outlets to communicate their very human and very normal emotions. Hiding behind the mask of manhood, of masculinity, scoffing at the idea of earnestness and vulnerability, and instead embracing the machismo of the true man. This, to them and to many men, seems like the path of least resistance. In a paper titled Masculinity, Societal Connectedness, and Mental Health, these all have colons, Men's Diverse Patterns of Practice, by McKinsey, Collings, Jenkin, and River, all PhDs by the way, a participant named Ben had this to say, quote, "We men do not talk like I'd talk with my wife about these issues. I don't think males talk about stuff like this, unless other ones do, but not me. If a male tried to talk to me about this, I'd probably hassle them." End quote. And the findings of the paper, of the studies carried out within, found evidence that tracked with this. Though not a scholarly source, Catherine attempts to shed light on this very same issue. This notion of what it means to be a man, as society has traditionally deemed it, is often directly causing friction with men's emotional well-being. And this is a huge problem in both America and Japan. I am not a Japanese native, and as such I feel somewhat uncomfortable critiquing their culture, but to say the parallels in America are much the same would be putting it lightly. Fortunately, at the time of writing in the year of 2023, there is an ever-increasing commitment to mental health in the male population at large. We aren't quite there yet, but these antiquated notions of masculinity in the form of stifling feelings and avoiding vulnerability seem to be disappearing rapidly. This is a step in the right direction. And what I love about Catherine's presentation with this is that it's not only life and death, but there's an air of indifference when things go wrong. This mirrors real life so well. If you choose not to interact with a bar patron or two, they will eventually die at the hands of the curse. We find this out through the news reports on the TV at the bar. When we hear our familiar patron's name or names, there is an inevitable, "What? Them? But I just saw them this past week." From Boss, the bar owner, or from Vincent, and then, well, that's it. We all move on and don't really care. In my experience, this has been the general reaction I've seen over these sorts of men's health issues. It's brushed off, it's not seen as such a big deal. They can take it, they're strong, they'll be okay. Complete indifference. The consequences, though, they're very real. As a quick extension on this topic, one can imagine a certain read on this as deflecting responsibility away from men. I think that this stance is just a bit misguided, however. The myriad studies aside, the game isn't presenting this as a means of letting men off the hook and saying that their behavior is dismissible due to the misgivings of their parents or of the expectations of society writ large. Not at all. In fact, through talking with each of these men, they eventually come to terms with the past and acknowledge that their faults are, at the end of the day, their own to wrangle. The past is unable to be changed. They pledge to do better by themselves, for themselves, and for others too. This is further highlighted in Vincent's own route when we encounter Nightmare Vincent, the sort of penultimate nightmare keeping us from the game's goal of true freedom. Only once Vincent conquers the trials and climbs the otherworldly tower from the 7 layers of hell that is his own conscience can he crest the hill to redemption and enact positive change within his life. It is imperative to find the root causes of these behaviors in society which men exhibit, but scapegoats they are not. As the saying goes, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. To be clear, the men in this game are not intended to be painted wholesale in a sympathetic light. This is where the game's second, and biggest, theme comes into play. The notion of soushokudanshi, a Japanese phrase that translates to the herbivore man. Before proceeding, I want to give a major thank you to the YouTube channel Beyond Ghibli and their terrific video on Catherine, titled The Herbivore and the Christmas Cake, a full-bodied critique of Catherine. This channel introduced me to the label of the herbivore man and led me into some deeply fascinating research, and it's just a really high-quality channel in general. The concept is this. The herbivore man in Japan is someone who has lost their aggressive edge in dating culture. They're no longer, quote, the hunter. Instead, they prefer to keep to themselves and reject the idea of dating and mating. They seek release of sexual tension through pornography or other solitary means, as the evolving cultural and societal gender norms give them anxiety and fear at best, and bitterness at worst. We have seen similar ideologies spring up here in the United States, particularly, and unfortunately, in the more extreme right-wing online spaces, such as self-proclaimed incels and the red-pilled movement. The herbivore man movement in Japanese culture isn't quite as enveloped in the anger and bitterness that the incel movement in the States is, however. The herbivore lifestyle, as I understand it, is a choice. It's a deliberate one that these men make. Many accounts I've read state that these men want partners. They want girlfriends or wives. Their expectation is that these relationships are owed to them. They're good guys, and as such, expect and demand that the women do the pursuing instead. Many men in these circles find contemporary women to be undesirable due to this, and yearn for a return to the more traditional gender norms from the past: a demure partner, a homemaker. While I want to reiterate again that critiquing another culture is not my place, and that this issue is more complicated than the scope of a podcast allows, it does seem to be another side of the misogynistic coin referenced above with the US counterparts. The writers of Catherine kept critique tame when it came to the moral judgment that I mentioned earlier in part 1. It is here where the claws come out. Catherine skewers these herbivore men with biting criticism highlighting their hypocrisy, their desire, as the late Ted Kaczynski may have put it, to eat their cake and have it too. These men cling to cultural standards that blossomed in the past and desire a stable relationship in which their partner is meek and perhaps submissive, but refuse themselves to put effort in and seek them out. Before we dig into this further, though, there's a third puzzle piece that will complete this picture as a whole. It's important that we talk now about Japan's population crisis. Japan is in a bit of a predicament when it comes to their population. While they are among the highest life expectancy in the world, which also grants them the highest population of elderly citizens, by the way, their birth rates are among the lowest. Indeed, in 2023, Japan saw a record low in birth rates at just less than 800,000 babies, while continuing a streak of population decline that has been going on for over a decade. This has broader implications ranging from the workforce and the economy to Japanese culture as a whole. It could genuinely be an entire essay in and of itself. The Japanese government has, of course, taken notice. Let me read a quick statistic from the Japan Times, an article from April of 2023. Quote, "Thus far, Japan has addressed this phenomenon, that is the population crisis, by focusing on the fertility rate. A country needs a total fertility rate, the average number of children a woman is expected to have in her lifetime, of 2.07 to maintain its population size. In 2021, Japan's total fertility rate was 1.3. As a result, new births fell below 800,000 for the first time ever. The government's goal was 1.8. The new projections project a rate of 1.36 in 2070. End quote. It's a complicated issue with many moving parts. The government's attention toward increasing fertility rates is pulling attention away from the needs and the demands of the elderly, who also require care and assistance because, remember, Japan's elderly population is among the highest in the world. This is the final piece of the puzzle, and in my eyes, perhaps the most crucial piece of it, to appreciating the allegory that the writers behind Catherine are implementing. Let's think back to our herbivore friends. The morality of their reasoning set aside for a moment, the reality of the situation is twofold. They aren't interested in procreating, and they are growing in size. If you'll remember from earlier, Catherine's story features a supernatural element known as the Curse of the Woman's Wrath. What we learn throughout the story is that our Mistress of the Night, Catherine with a C, is actually a succubus, a demon that tempts men. We're led to believe, based on the Curse of the Woman's Wrath, that she appears to men who cheat as a sort of punishment for their infidelity. She appears to each man exactly as their innermost desires want her to, while Vincent sees her as a busty, blonde and blue-eyed beauty with porcelain skin. When Catherine allows the other men to see her, she will appear differently to each one, based on their own proclivities. Catherine herself wants nothing more than to have fun. She doesn't want commitment, she doesn't even want a relationship. She exists to throw herself to these herbivore men, these individuals yearning for something they believe they deserve, but won't themselves pursue, and asks nothing in return from them. The diegetic result of this, the punishment, is the death of these unfaithful men. But the Curse of the Woman's Wrath isn't targeting men who are unfaithful. They just happen to be a smaller subset of the larger group. Catherine's motivation, the real impetus behind the curse of the woman's wrath, is to remove and eliminate all men who are uninterested in procreating and contributing to the growth of the population. Let's sit on this for a moment, because this is Catherine's most damning critique. We are led to believe from the beginning that this is all centered around cheating men, that this curse by some otherworldly witch entity is indicative of women getting their due revenge. They even go so far as to present Catherine McBride, that's Catherine with a K once again, as overly pushy and demanding, lacing each text Vincent receives from her with a condescending sigh while painting Catherine with a C as a bubbly reprise. This is by design. They want you, expect you to feel exhausted with each interaction with K Catherine and look forward to the late-night antics of C Catherine. They want you to sympathize with Vincent and with Toby, Johnny, and Orlando at the bar, who give him plenty of words of caution about being, quote, tied down. But this is nothing more than a red herring. What Atlus really wants to say is that the selfishness of this herbivore movement is directly contributing to the failing Japanese population, and that we'd be better off rid of them entirely for the best chance of the continuation of the Japanese people. Of course, Atlus isn't really calling for the death or removal of these people, as they portray in the game. It's a fantasy, a metaphor, an allegory, and a sharp one at that. They cleverly disguise this in such a way that what they've been thinking all along only becomes apparent at the very end of the narrative. This is a serious issue in Japan, one that, as we saw above, isn't predicted to stabilize even by the year 2070, over 40 years from right now. I'll be completely honest. This concept of Japan's shrinking population was maybe something I was mildly aware of, something that I would have conceivably said, oh yeah, I've heard of that, had you asked me. Chalk it up to American bullheadedness or a lack of effort to stay informed on my part, I suppose. But once I became aware of this, and of the herbivore male movement, partly from the channel Beyond Ghibli, partly from other sources, everything in Catherine just clicked. Everything made sense. I often call Catherine Persona's more mature, older cousin. It's a bit of a reductive and certainly tongue-in-cheek take, as the first three Persona titles alone deal with heavy psychological concepts and the notion of fearlessness in the face of death itself. But where the Persona titles allow themselves to expand in breadth with social links, holiday events, and school life, Catherine keeps its narrative more or less focused throughout. Once you're aware of the thematic cables running through the duration of the game, you begin to see them everywhere. Every meaningful interaction serves to either support the two thematic ideas I touched on above, the dire need of support systems for men's emotional well-being and the effect of the herbivore movement on Japanese population, or move the in-game story forward such that it can introduce a new plot beat. And those plot beats, you guessed it, tend to focus on these two themes. The game features quite a few endings, 8 in the classic version and 13 in the full-body re-release, and some of them do lightly betray the thematic vision of the game. Honestly, I think this can be chalked up to the work ultimately being a piece of fiction entertainment. This is even more prevalent in the full-body version, wherein each bit of added narrative content seems to be entirely divorced from these themes and sloppily implemented at that. This is a bit of a shame, as full body is more ubiquitous on modern consoles, while Classic is stuck on the original PS3 and Xbox 360 releases. Classic is available on Steam as well, while full body is not, though getting it to run on modern specs, for whatever reason, can be a little tricky. The full body story content, in a true double-edged fashion, is plentiful but inserted in painfully obvious ways. Characters will often segue from the original dialogue into new dialogue with non sequiturs like, anyway, or, oh, by the way. It's easy enough to separate the wheat from the chaff here if you're paying attention. But this isn't the time or the place for ripping on full body. Join the Discord if you want more of that. I am happy to oblige. Catherine is a profoundly human game. It's one of its greatest strengths. From beginning to end, even as the story gets increasingly bizarre, it is grounded deeply in feelings, notions, and experiences that most all of us undergo in modern life. The thematic through lines I've discussed today, the brilliantly real writing the characters are given, the setting, so much coalesces together within Catherine to create an experience that is as unique as this game demands. At the time of writing in 2023, these themes still resonate with great frequency. We are seeing no shortage of online influencers attempting to target male insecurity to take them from low-confidence boys to top Gs by means of excess, vanity, pride, and selfishness. We are continuing to see improvements in how society views opening up about feelings across all genders, but the stigma of doing so, in many circles, still remains. And recent statistics from 2022 indicate that Japan's population is still falling, at just under 125.5 million people, with 2022 being the 12th consecutive year of decline. Then, to look at things from a different angle, is Catherine itself as a video game? Something that this essay only brushed upon by design. You'll have to forgive me on that one. If we look to contemporary gaming practices, there seems to be a growing trend of homogenization insofar as presentation and overall delivered experience. Cinematicism, hyper-realistic graphics with color palettes swathed in grays and browns, gruff protagonists making their way through the story full of action-packed gameplay. It's an emulation of the medium of film. Not inherently a bad thing, though not always capitalizing on the idiosyncrasies of video games as a medium. This all being the case, I can think of no better reason to revisit Catherine today. Whether you've never played the game before or have seen it through to one of its many endings, I challenge you to explore Catherine and reflect on these thematic concepts. One needn't be from Japan to glean the broader implications from the subjects we've talked about today. At the beginning of our time together, I read a quote by Kurt Vonnegut. Do you remember it? Curing the terrible disease of loneliness. Catherine is a game that challenges its players to confront their own feelings about loneliness, about judgment, and about life itself. Quote, "There's no should or should not when it comes to having feelings," Fred Rogers once wrote in his work, The World According to Mr. Rogers. He goes on to say, "When we can believe that, we may find it easier to make constructive choices about what to do with those feelings." End quote. If I've played my part adequately in the past, better part of an hour or so with you, I hope you'll see how the words of Rogers and Vonnegut intertwine, and how they drive at the very heart of the issues presented in Atlus's cult hit. The societal problems presented here can seem insurmountable when viewed all at once. Real change, lasting change, comes from within. One step at a time, just as the bar patrons had done, just as Vincent had done, and with any luck, just as we can do too. My challenge to you is to consider this as you reflect on the story of Catherine. In the meantime, I'll be at the Stray Sheep, right here at the bar. Think I'll have a beer. How about you? Thank you for listening to this essay on pixelprojectradio titled The Thematic Elements of Catherine. If you want to hear more, you can find us on all of your major podcatching devices, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Podcast Addict, etc. We're on social media on Instagram and Twitter, and we have a Discord as well. You can come join, you can come interact with the community. All of these links and more will be in the episode description. Thank you for spending some time with me today. My name is Rick Firestone, the host of Pixel Project Radio. I'll catch you next time. Take care.